Hi everyone, Blind Dweller here. Today we finally arrive at the last installment of the Francis Bacon series, A Tainted Talent. I had no idea when I first started typing the first words for the first script of Francis Bacon that it would take this many videos, but here we are. It's been a really fun journey for me, and a huge thank you to you if you've made it this far. In this final episode, we continue our story with Francis and his new partner, George Dyer, as well as looking at the fascinating collection of Bacon's paintings released from the 60s right up until his final painting, found shortly after his death. If you've just stumbled across this video and you're wondering what on earth any of this means, please follow the link for the full series playlist that I've left in the description below, so that you can get started from the beginning in part 1. This last episode also turned out to be a lot longer than what I usually produce, so make sure that you're extra comfortable for this one. And with that said, welcome to another video, and welcome to the final chapter of the story and artwork of Francis Bacon. If there was one tender quality of Francis Bacon that would often emerge from beneath his frequent dark humour and rebellious attitude, it was his love and fascination of the people around him, especially those within his close circles. Aside from his close friend and popular subject for a lot of his figurative paintings, Lucian Freud, Bacon would have many other friends and fellow artists from all walks of life pose and model for his paintings. Bacon eventually chose to paint from photographs instead of from life, not just because he had a large collection of photographs to choose from, but because of his extroverted personality and social tendencies. He would often feel more concerned about attending to the sitter, fetching them drinks, battling any potential judgment from the sitter, and getting distracted by conversations often spurred on to avoid any awkward silence. Painting from still images and photography allowed Bacon to have full control and freedom to unload his own creative spin on the person he was trying to illustrate, whether that be twisting or exaggerating their features and characteristics that would inspire Bacon, or even adding injuries to the sitter. The figures that Bacon created would often have injuries of some form or another, and this certainly was not new, but it certainly was curious as to how and why he would envision such injuries on even his closest friends. Not to mention this too would make painting from life incredibly awkward for Bacon and the sitter, as you can probably imagine. One of the best known examples of this would be another free-spirited female companion that Bacon instinctively looked up to, named Henrietta Moraes. Henrietta was a British model for figurative artists, including Lucian Freud, whom Bacon met apparently during a time she had a romantic fling with Freud, and the two would discover a valuable friendship in each other. Bacon was not just inspired by the male body, but also the female body had proven to be an irresistible subject for his paintings. Henrietta was curvaceous, strong-framed, if not muscular, and she was toughened by a traumatic upbringing that Bacon would crave to express. Francis would eventually ask Henrietta, whom already had some experience in artist modelling at this point, if she'd be willing to model nude for him. Though he did of course have to mention that he would only paint from photographs, and so he would ask his friend, photographer John Deacon, to take some shots of her in various positions. Bacon was extremely selective and particular of what he wanted from the photographs, however, even discarding the results of a first photo shoot, which unfortunately consisted of photographs of a very uncomfortable-looking Henrietta, in overly sexualized angles, most likely because of the instructions of Deacon. Bacon was still focused around the reclining figure that had some movement of the flesh and strong bone structure, a regular appearance in a lot of his paintings by now, but he also saw something very specific in Henrietta that would not be achieved with photos of a poor woman being displayed like an adult film actress. Bacon saw a profound vulnerability in Henrietta, a delicate soul beneath the tough exterior that she maintained, that Bacon would eventually display in many different forms, at least 15 times from 1963 onwards. But arguably the most significant work surrounding Henrietta would be his painting later released in 1968, titled Version No. 2 of Lying Figure with Hypodermic Syringe. This displays a female figure, splayed in a reclining position on a bed, with a hypodermic syringe sticking into her arm. This painting was again modelled and referenced from a photograph of Henrietta, who did unfortunately fall to a terrible heroin addiction during the 60s. Bacon would explain in interviews that the purpose of the syringe was simply to use as an unusual object to nail the figure to the bed, but Henrietta later in life would admit that the painting astoundingly foreshadowed a side of her life that she did not foresee, but perhaps in silence, Bacon did anticipate. The figure in the painting in itself looks like a dramatic display of someone who has died from a drug overdose. It would seem even when Francis illustrated women, he would not exclude them from the darker sides of a human experience like that of his male figures. Bacon's final painting starring Henrietta would be the following year in 1969, with the triptych titled Three Studies of Henrietta Moraes, which Bacon would even confess to saying were, quote, one of the best sets of three heads I've ever done. By the time the 60s was in full swing, it goes to little surprise that things were beginning to change very quickly and dramatically, not just in the political and economic side of things, but within the arts as well. The music scene, for example, that was once what Bacon remembered as a swinging scene of jazz clubs, was now evolving into pop bands playing electric guitars, writing songs about the power of love and unity, something that Bacon could not personally relate to. But even the lifestyle of creative people within this new rising hippie movement would not complement that of Bacon's. Bacon by now was in his 50s, and although a widely respected and famous painter at this time, he was inevitably slipping into the category of old-fashioned artists. Although a leading and inspirational figure to the alienated and misunderstood youth, he was still beginning to be overshadowed by the icons of newer art movements, such as abstract art and pop art, from the likes of artists such as Andy Warhol, Bridget Riley, and Roy Lichtenstein, just to name a few. Bacon was now part of a dying breed of artists, but Bacon still would not falter or stray from his true style to in some way appeal to the more popular crowds. Bacon was also still very much a wild partygoer, but by now was sticking to a very dedicated and strict routine of nothing but painting in the morning in his studio, save in drinking, gambling, and other such social activities for the evenings and late afternoons. The schedule would unfortunately prove to be a very tricky thing to maintain, however, with his new partner during this period, George Dyer. The relationship of George and Francis would begin to sour as the 60s went on. Their almost completely opposite demeanours and personalities were now no longer gelling together, with Francis sometimes being awoken in the very early hours of the morning by a very intoxicated George after a night out, bringing back mobs of people, most of whom were strangers to Francis, with George pestering Francis to stay up and talk to him. When annoyances such as these would arise, Bacon would often react with cold, sarcastic, and degrading comments that George would take to heart, causing them to row endlessly. Though Francis, in his own complicated way, was simultaneously disappointed by George's apparent weakness and overly emotional reactions to their heated arguments. As opposed to Bacon's previous lover, Peter Lacy, George was more sensitive and hurt by the flying insults and goading that Francis would aim at him. When Francis expected the aggression that he was attracted to, George instead would submit like a wounded animal, even threatening to commit suicide on numerous occasions. A sight that Francis was repulsed by, and the more the routine continued, the more Francis would begin to run out of patience. Even very early into their relationship, Bacon would seek further opportunities to be by himself in order to continue painting, which unfortunately would render his usual abode of No. 7 Rees Mews as not an option whilst George was on occasion still living with him. This would lead Bacon to obtain many different studios around London where he would continue to paint. During periods when Francis could tolerate George, he would often love to use his partner as the subject of many paintings during the 60s. Even though Bacon found the social awkwardness of painting from life too distracting, none of these kind of issues existed between Bacon and Dyer, and so a vast collection of paintings taken from photos of George, or of him posing directly in front of Francis, would be completed showing George in many different transformations. For example, another of Bacon's surreal oil on canvas triptychs titled Three Figures in a Room, completed in 1964, displays George Dyer in the nude in 3 different positions, displaying what is described as George being both sexualized and in a state of humility. In the middle and right panels, we can see George displayed in poses of seduction, whilst the left panel, in stark contrast, shows George in arguably a very unflattering position, posed on the toilet with his back to the viewer. Essentially, Francis is capturing both the most desirable qualities of George as well as the most human and private aspects. Maybe this painting, in a lot of ways, shows a longing for what Francis saw as beautifully primal and human in George Dyer during the early years of their relationship. Unfortunately, George would not see his partner's paintings in the same light, especially when such images of him would be hung up on walls to wide audiences in most galleries around the world, displaying him bare buttocked on the toilet. Another painting of George, titled Portrait of George Dyer Crouching, completed in 1966, displays George in a manner that is almost ape-like, or like that of a Neanderthal. On the strange, circular furniture, possibly inspired from Bacon's previous experience in interior design, we can see a crumpled up shirt lying on the seat, as if it's just been thrown in a tantrum by the crouching figure. On his head is a white sheet tied into 4 corners to serve as a head covering, even though I tried to look up what this is exactly called so many times, because I've seen this kind of head covering before, it was all in vain in the end. So if anyone knows a technical term for this head covering, please let me know in the comments. Whatever it might be, for me, the first thought that came to my head was that George was painted to have a nappy resting on his head, only increasing a bizarre imagery of George being portrayed as some kind of village idiot, or a mindless animal, or an out-of-control infant. Although paintings of George Dyer may have started out eroticized or loving to begin with, it's simply stunning to see now such a blatant stab at George's more sensitive personality, yet at the same time it's attempted to be subtle enough to those who may be less involved in the art crowd, like George. You could almost say that it displays the kind of insults that would be thrown around behind closed doors whenever Francis and George would argue, as well as displaying how decayed the relationship was becoming year after year. Francis was infamous for his occasional insults and sarcasm, and as our arguing continued, so did his taunts and prods towards Dyer, even when George continued to threaten to commit suicide, with near tears in his eyes. Bacon, now fatigued from the dramatics, would only be tempted to snidely respond to him, saying he wished he'd, quote, just bloody well get on with it. The disagreements became so toxic that George even once attempted to frame Francis for possession of cannabis with intent to sell to younger groups of boys. After grassing up to the police and a subsequent warrant for a house search arrived at Rees Mews, the incident ended with a 9-month investigation and left Francis in a bad public light. One of the biggest strains on Francis, however, would be when George would directly ruin and interfere Bacon's art, and this was not merely interrupting Bacon's dedicated painting schedule. In one such instance, in a blind rage brought on by another row, George trashed and destroyed a great deal of Bacon's art studio and his paintings. He broke canvases and threw them in a bathtub, poured paint and wine everywhere, and he even set fire to the studio, probably causing more damage than he intended. And he had somehow managed to throw 3/3 of the furniture down the apartment's staircase. But damage to the studio and the state of the furniture would be insignificant, however, to what really infuriated Francis, which was that now his paintings, his very purpose and livelihood, had been directly and senselessly attacked by George. Francis, already growing weary of George, saw this vain attempt of George trying to prove his tough masculinity to Francis as just another push to distance himself from him. By 1969, Bacon felt his spotlight in London was beginning to dim. Already feeling that he and his art was becoming irrelevant to the new trends of a Western world that London was lapping up, he felt he needed a new change of scenery and people. Although by now his art had reached as far as a Marlborough Gallery in New York City, USA, Bacon unfortunately felt no more at home in the Big Apple either. Although he managed to sell a great deal of his paintings during his first visit to New York, Bacon's art was receiving average reception compared to his previous exhibitions in London and Europe. And much like London, the New York art scene had a much keener eye for the more fashionable and stronger market. Quite simply, the art scene in the Western world was slowly but surely beginning to become an industry. However, an unexpected invitation to do a retrospective exhibition would land in Bacon's lap, this time from a familiar country that Francis already knew well. Bacon was invited to return to Paris and France to exhibit his paintings to a European audience who were fairly indifferent to Bacon's painting at this time, but the French art scene had little interest in the Western trends either. Though aside from already experiencing France, the more traditional art scene, and the fact that France was where Bacon was first prompted to paint by seeing Picasso, the main motivation to return to France was because at this stage, no other British artists during Bacon's lifetime, aside from Graham Sutherland, had been invited to do a retrospective exhibition in Paris. Such an honour and opportunity for Francis to truly leave his stamp in art history was there for the taking. His return to Paris would mark the emergence of what could be described as Bacon's most tangible representation of a powerful encounters between man and beast. Completed in 1969, his three violent but stunning paintings that would later be named as the Bullfight would be the first released at his soon-to-be retrospective exhibition at the Grand Palais in Paris 2 years later. There are many aspects of these three paintings to absorb, but the main focus, of course, focuses on the bull and the fighter, painted as if intertwined with each other in a dance. Aside from this being a literal confrontation, for Bacon, this controversial tradition exposed a hypocrisy in people's attitude towards animals, seeing it as, quote, illogical that people would condemn bullfighting, yet would still wear fur coats and eat meat.
These stupid things about bullfighting, because if you go, people will eat meat and then complain about bullfighting. The thing is, they're mad. They will go in and complain about bullfighting covered with furs and birds in their hair. I mean, it's so illogical.
In terms of visual references for these paintings, Francis, as you might have guessed, sourced his inspiration for the dramatic poses of the bull and fighter from his vast photo collections in his studio, accompanying the man and the bull with a vivid yellow background and a crowd spectating from a small cramped space. If we observe Study for a Bullfight number 1 and 2, the crowds of the faceless people are tussling and almost cascading over the barrier, as if breaking into a riot to join the dance of death and survival that we see in the middle. The most head-turning quality in the crowd, however, is the unmistakable sight of Nazi symbols and emblems. Francis Bacon, some might say, had a fascination in Nazi imagery. Perhaps due to the horrors of the Second World War, he found it intriguing how after the war had ended, such imagery would now evoke such a powerful response from viewers. Close friend and art historian Michael Pepeot believes the reference to Nazi imagery in these paintings may point to the barbarity of a crowd, in which civilized behaviour can so rapidly deteriorate. A likely outcome for any society should people continue to slip away from awareness and self-reflection. In the third painting, titled Second Version of Study for a Bullfight number 1, we can see this time the crowd has been replaced by a white screen or a white void. The bullfighter has more of a shadow or silhouette appearance compared to the other version, adding a more haunting quality to this particular painting. These three beautiful works would mark the start of a new fascinating subject for Bacon's art. The subject of a bull and the bullfight would continue over the years, right up to his very last painting, before he died, some 2 decades later. Study for a Bullfight number 1 would be the eye-catching image on the banners and posters for Francis Bacon's retrospective exhibition in Paris. Francis decided to focus his efforts on securing his art to enter the Grand Palais, considered to be the most historically treasured venues for European art, famous for its large steel and glass-domed roof, considered to be the largest in Europe at the time. Finally, his wish would be granted by the French government to arrange a solo opening at the Grand Palais, scheduled for the autumn of 1971. Francis would be the first British artist ever to be granted a showing at the famous gallery. It would be the moment of Bacon's life. Francis was of course still in a relationship with George, who by now was in a very dangerous and unpredictable state of mind. George was continuing to spiral into a suicidal depression spurred on by excessive drinking, drug use, and constant arguments with Francis, who at this time was trying to ensure his most important exhibition of his career would proceed smoothly. The last thing he needed was another drunk and melodramatic George embarrassing him or getting him into trouble again. But regardless of the thick tension between the two, the couple would travel together to Paris for the event. They would share a suite at the Hotel du Saint-Palais, along with Valerie Beston, a loyal manager and organizer for Francis. Valerie played an important role in both the artist's professional and private lives. She organised practically everything on Bacon's behalf, from arranging paintings to be collected from his studio, supervising catalogues of Bacon's exhibitions, to organising his doctor's appointments, and even paying his bills. She took this in her stride, however, and she adored Francis as a friend, regarding it as her duty to make sure that his life ran as smoothly as possible in order that he would be able to paint uninterrupted, which may have played a part in what exactly happened over the period of their stay in the Saint-Palais Hotel that year. Just to emphasise how big this event would be for Francis, almost everyone he knew would appear in Paris for the event, including his youngest sister Ianthe and her teenage daughter Mary. An English ambassador would also be attending, sent by the British Embassy to ensure Bacon's affairs ran smoothly, and even the former French president, Georges Pompidou, was due to open the exhibition in person, being a keen art advocate himself. The pressures for Bacon must have been overwhelming. Outside the Grand Palais, the day before the opening, Francis would return from lunch out in Paris and walk past the entrance of a gallery on the way back to the hotel. The banners and posters were set, a deep red carpet had been laid out, and he even had an armed honour guard drilling outside the Grand Palais in preparation for his opening. Francis was elated. The red carpet was both a literal and figurative sign that the city was ready to welcome him in open arms, and he returned to the hotel in high spirits. But when he returned, the mood was sour within just moments. Francis would return to his suite to find George paralytically drunk and incoherent, the room potent with the smell of alcohol, drugs, and sex. And sure enough, Francis would notice a rent boy lying in the bed with George. Francis was exasperated, and Valerie Beston would describe the confrontation as a terrific row. Francis would storm out of a hotel to attend a reception in the evening, spending the long hours of the night gambling and drinking with friends. When he returned to the suite once again, the room stank of apparently the rent boy's feet, so in hopes of a decent night's sleep before his opening day, at roughly 2 o'clock in the morning, he chose to sleep in the second bed of a room in the floor below, with his friend and colleague of Valerie Beston, Terry Danziger-Miles, who appears and recounts this particular event in many documentaries on Francis Bacon. The next morning, Francis asked Terry if he could check upstairs to see if George had, quote, gotten rid of that bloody Arab. He would meet Valerie Beston on the way to the room, completely unprepared for what they would discover inside. Valerie and Terry would discover the dead body of George Dyer, who had apparently died the night before, sitting on the toilet, leaning forward in the ensuite bathroom. The cause of death was alcohol consumption mixed with an unsafe dose of what the couple's practitioner, Dr. Paul Brass, confirmed to be Bacon's sleeping pills. The news inevitably reached downstairs where Francis was eagerly waiting, and when he was informed, he shed no tears, apparently reacting with an almost strange detachment from the affair. Valerie knew this would mean jeopardy of everything planned for the opening that afternoon. If the news of George's death would emerge, it would dominate the news of the opening. And so a relatively questionable decision was made by her, the hotel manager, and Francis himself, to make sure the body would not be discovered until at least the following morning to not interfere with the opening at the Grand Palais, as well as the following scheduled private viewing and a grand dinner and after party in the evening. This is when the darker truths of Francis Bacon's career begin to show their ugly faces, because let's not mince words here. To not report a death or a dead body in most places around the world is considered an incredibly serious crime. Yet the deed had to be done in the mind of both Francis and Valerie, or the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity would slip between their fingers. There is also the matter of Bacon's strange initial reaction to his lover's death, which paints Francis in a certain light. Though this could be attributed to the tumultuous nature of their relationship by this time, or by his toughened outlook due to his previous experiences. But just imagine being Francis Bacon in this situation for a second. Nearly a decade earlier, you have lost a loved one around the opening of a similarly life-changing exhibition, only now to discover in almost the same fashion another person close to you has died, this time only hours before the opening of your life. I have no idea how I would react to this. It would be, for lack of a better term, almost too bad to be true. Perhaps the reaction of Francis was more human than what's normally recounted. Perhaps his reaction was pure shock, with a head whirling with thoughts of terrible possible outcomes that could erupt from this. Valerie Beston would state that despite his somewhat quiet reaction, she could see clear devastation in his eyes. Bacon eventually headed upstairs, arm in arm with Valerie, to see the body for himself. After some time, Valerie would discreetly lock the door to the room where the motionless body of George remained positioned on the toilet. Bacon appeared distraught on the way to the opening later that day, but would outwardly remain calm and confident as he would emerge from the car onto the red carpet at the Grand Palais. The event appeared to be running smoothly at first, but of course whispers would soon bounce around the showrooms from more familiar faces, wondering where George might be, and close circles knew that George had come along to Paris with Francis. But as is the nature of such devastating news, the confirmed word of George Dyer's death quickly began to, quote, filter out, as Michael Pepeot put it, by the evening that day during the grand dinner at the extravagant restaurant Le Tram Bleu. And this would cause a terribly tragic situation of people approaching Francis to inform him of his partner's death, which of course he was already fully aware of, reportedly play-acting a lot of his reactions during this event. To put the hauntingly bizarre nature of this scenario into perspective, it's worth noting that the 1964 triptych of George that we looked at earlier, titled 3 Figures in a Room, would also be featured in the gallery that day, displaying the unavoidably ironic image of George in the left panel, sitting and leaning forwards on the toilet, almost illustrating exactly how George was found dead barely a few hours before. To be Francis, walking around the showrooms whilst trying to be as professional and sociable as possible, yet constantly seeing that panel in the corner of his eye, is something near impossible to comprehend. Not to mention the fact that the French state would purchase this painting, and President Pompidou himself was reportedly standing in front of the painting for a long period of time, with Francis even having to explain the meaning of the work to him. After the final proceedings of the day had concluded, Francis slept once again in the spare bed in Terry's room, with George still sitting upstairs. With Bacon's retrospective described as astonishing by the Times newspapers, the weight of the event was beginning to ease. A once outsider artist in the contemporary world, Bacon was now a prominent figure. Italian film director Bernardo Bertolucci would also eventually attend the Grand Palais to see Bacon's paintings, and he would be deeply inspired by what he saw. He would decide to use the images of Francis Bacon's paintings during the opening credits of the film he was completing at the time, called Last Tango in Paris, starring Marlon Brando. who too would also come to experience Francis Bacon's paintings at the show. Although Francis himself disliked the film, it was successful and well received to mass audiences, and proof that Bacon's paintings were still very appealing to the more fashionable creatives at the time. But despite his growing success and his new beginning in Paris, it did not make the post-mortem and the funeral of George Dyer any easier for Francis. Grief and guilt would begin to grip tightly on the artist over the next few years after George's death. Perhaps it was due to this period of mourning that Francis would eventually tell other people that George had committed suicide, although much like the situation with Peter Lacy, his death would never officially be confirmed as a suicide as opposed to accidental. But Francis could not help but feel remorseful, almost blaming himself for leaving George in a room, not realizing how bad a state he was in. Perhaps also feeling guilty for the way their relationship had become, and perhaps he felt he took a more loving and vulnerable side of George for granted. And so it would be in the same year of 1971 up until 1973 when Francis would complete a series of triptychs that would essentially replay the events of George's death. Once again, we can see a very rare but beautifully sincere side of Bacon's personality, a side that is truly opening up to the realities and coldness of how George died. Something that must have been emotionally devastating for Francis, considering that according to Michael Pepeot, Francis would revisit the same hotel where George had died to basically relive the moments of the event in order to complete these incredibly raw paintings, giving us another front row seat view of Bacon attempting to unload and cleanse his soul onto canvas and close this terrible chapter.
I'm not at all an expressionist painting. I'm not trying to express anything. I wasn't trying to express the sorrow about somebody committing suicide or something like that when I did those portraits of myself, but perhaps it comes through without knowing it.
Following his retrospective show in Paris, Francis chose to remain in the city for a few years. It would also be the decade of the 70s that Francis would begin an interesting period of completing many self-portraits from 1972 up until 1979. The reason behind this, according to Bacon, was a sad one. Bacon, for many understandable reasons, was beginning to develop a somewhat bleak realization of his own mortality. By now, a lot of his closest friends and loved ones had passed away, including his mother Winifred, the same year George had died. So Francis started to experiment with self-portraits rather than other people like he normally does because, quote, "People have been dying around me like flies, and I have nobody else to paint but myself." Though he would not exclusively paint self-portraits alone, in between these works, he would complete paintings that continued the theme of capturing inspirations from photographs and art catalogues. Even George Dyer would continue to discreetly appear in his paintings. From the mid-70s onwards, another frequent star was also beginning to appear in Bacon's paintings during this decade. In what could be seen as a way of easing his guilt and self-punishment over the death of Dyer, Francis would eventually meet and fall for a man during the mid-70s, another charismatic, East End roguelike character named John Edwards. Edwards, however, was not a former RAF pilot, nor was he a criminal thug, but this time a pub landlord, who then was helping his brothers to manage 3 pubs in the East End area of London. Interestingly, he was also not a closeted homosexual or a curious straight man like Lacy and Dyer might have been, but instead, he was incredibly confident and open about his interest in men, which too must have felt like a breath of fresh air for Francis. Although the relationship started as romantic, the bond between the two would eventually become more of a paternal one. Perhaps due to the significant difference in age, with Francis being in his 60s and John being in his mid-20s. They did not have a sexual relationship, but were still seen by their friends as inseparable and devoted to one another. Though, as Mark Stevens puts it in the Brush with Violence documentary, it was not always clear who was the father and who was the son. The sad truth is, Francis was now a homosexual man in his autumn years, a harsh reality that Francis was vocally conscious about. Homosexuality relies on beauty, he would say, and that age inevitably diminishes any physically appealing qualities. Francis no longer felt like a rebellious, wide-eyed young artist, but an old man living in a world that now belonged to the young. The punk movement of the 70s may have found the controversial interviews of Francis Bacon being vocally non-sentimental somewhat appealing, but inevitably, his habits were beginning to calm with age. And although still an active socialite, he was less inclined now to partake in late-night parties over precious time to work on his paintings. Annalyn Swan would describe the intriguing detail of the self-portraits Francis Bacon released in the 70s. She explains how when one of the earliest self-portraits from the series is compared to a later one, completed in 1979, it displays a profound evolution of Bacon's state of mind and how he saw himself during his decade.
In his self-portraits, we often see the mood of Bacon at the moment. The 1972 one is eyes downcast, quietly contemplative, with broad brushstrokes, very much in command of the canvas. In contrast, the 1979 self-portrait is of a face coming apart. It's of an aging queen. His lipstick is smeared. There's pancake makeup on his face. At this particular moment in time, Bacon was very upset because John Edwards was moving away from him. He stayed in his life, but he made it perfectly clear to Bacon that he was going to have only a certain role in his life. So the two images together are extremely revealing of Bacon's moods.
But in one way or another, Francis would find relief from his loneliness and existentialism in his new partner, John Edwards. Although Edwards still reportedly had a temper, he would not give in to a violent tantrum like Peter or George. He would often shrug off Bacon's prodding and goading, and most importantly, he was someone refreshing in and amongst a crowd that were mostly congratulating, handshaking brown-nosed art fans. Francis adored his success, though he would often admit that people would easily bore him if they were too ingratiating. He needed someone outside of his usual circle who would not constantly suck up to him. He may have stated to his closest friends that he never saw himself again in a serious relationship. But nevertheless, in the year 1976, when Francis was back in London from Paris, he would meet the young, dark, curly-haired EastEnder after Francis had failed to turn up to the event that John Edwards had organised. He would approach Francis, shouting in a thick Cockney accent, "So you're the f*** who I got champagne in for, then you didn't turn up to drink it? What kind of bloke are you?" Needless to say, this spectacle and heated exchange may have intimidated most, yet it seemed to have amused and attracted Francis, and a relationship between the two would soon follow.
Well, when I first met Francis, I thought it was like a little bit like sort of lamb dressed like mutton a little bit. So he had these tight corduroy trousers, and he had quite a good for his age. And I thought I'd say to myself, he looks quite cool, and he used to wear this tight gold bangle around his neck, which, if I used to wear any gold, he used to tell me to take it off. I had my ear pierced in '85, just before the big show in the Tate Gallery. And it was one of those ones where you do it by a machine. You know, you click it on, and you can't take it off then. I said, I've all friends, I said, I just can't take it off, you know, it's gonna have to stay for 2 weeks. He said, no, I'll take it off, and he just wrenched it off with one hand. And my ears started bleeding.
Throughout their time together, Edwards, much like Lacey and Dyer, would eventually start modelling for Bacon. And as others have rightly pointed out, there is something strangely different about the portraits and studies of Edwards compared to that of Bacon's former lovers. Unlike the representations of Lacey being a dominating ominous figure, or Dyer being portrayed in a degrading or satirical fashion, Edwards is portrayed as a gentle and erotic presence in his paintings. His face still warped and altered like in his later piece titled 3 Studies for a Portrait of John Edwards, completed in 1980, though in a manner that is more complementary to Edwards' strong features, such as drawing closer attention to his cheekbones and over-pronouncing his lips, using cooler tones of greys and creamy whites for shading and highlights, and putting them up against a calm and serene pale blue background that seems to add more significance to the gentle expression that Francis has created for his partner.
I don't believe in love, really. I mean, love is marvellous if it happens.
And not only sexual love, I mean love of life, love of friends, love of...
Well, I would have said the sexual obsession was the strongest one. Sex is what it is.
Well, surely
Sex is what it is. It's a moment of ecstasy. If you like the person, or if you don't even like them. But it's really the moment of c***ing, isn't it? Of c***ing off. That's what its pleasure is, isn't it? Cheers.
Cheers.
Even with Francis still putting the word love in between quotation marks, even if he was amused by the sight of other couples having a fight, sometimes even encouraging breakups and believing love is just a sheet to throw over the very more real primal lust. And even if his relationship to Edwards was just paternal, Francis had fallen in love again. And if he denied it, his very own paintings would argue otherwise. By the time the 80s had begun, Bacon was continuing to experiment with his concepts and subjects in his paintings, completing works that were beginning to display a new and interesting trait. His paintings were slowly but surely becoming more minimalistic, leaving a lot of exposed canvas incorporated into his scenes, and also his medium was noticeably changing. In addition to his usual choice of oil paints and household emulsions from a DIY store, Bacon was beginning to employ aerosol paint into his work, creating these eye-catching, ghostly qualities that were apparently becoming less violent and more composed, almost tranquil. Bacon has also by now opened prestigious exhibitions all over the world, eventually reaching as far as Japan by 1983. Now in his 70s, Bacon was at the height of his fame, and according to francisbacon.com, when Tate Britain celebrated him with a second retrospective in 1985, the then director Sir Alan Bowness declared him as the greatest living painter. But sadly, this new success was kick-started by another tragic death of a loved one, this time being Bacon's youngest sister Winifred, who had previously moved back to London from Rhodesia due to falling ill to multiple sclerosis in 1977. Francis would financially support her right up to the end, but sadly, she would eventually pass away in 1981. In the same year of his sister's death, Bacon would complete another haunting triptych that once again reflects his fascination in the Furies in the ancient Greek tragedy The Aristean Trilogy by Aeschylus. It is titled Triptych inspired by Orestia of Aeschylus. This, as far as we know, is the only painting Bacon completed that directly references the Greek playwright in the title. Bacon, however, would still dispute this, and explain that the Fury on the left was in fact inspired from a photograph he had in his collection of a pelican diving. What is so interesting about this period in his art career is his eagerness to return to his earlier inspirations and ideas, briefly stepping away from the more figurative genre of art and back to the more surreal style of creating hybrid, biomorphic creatures. This would continue all the way through the 80s, to a point where Francis would curiously reimagine his first ever masterpiece, 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion. He would release an astonishingly familiar triptych, titled Second Version of Triptych 1944. The infamous post-war monsters return in this piece in their snarling and screeching glory, posed in the same positions but with strikingly clear differences. The background this time is more vast and a deeper red as opposed to the fiery orange in the original. The middle panel is only partially accompanied by the red colour, with bare canvas being exposed on either side. There are also patches of black aerosol paint in some of the panels, creating phantom-like shadows beneath the figures. The shadows and highlights are also far more refined and technically improved from a decade's worth of experience at this stage. But probably the most significant difference in this later version is the distance of the figures compared to the original. In the 1944 version, the figures are up close, intrusive, and therefore more aggressive in nature. Whether this was intentional or not, the figures in his 1988 version are further away from the viewer, creating the sense that these figures are now more subdued, appearing almost as if they're made of silk. Again adding to the seemingly growing collection of calmer and less violent paintings. This recreation of his earlier work could also indicate Bacon's unfaltering desire to improve not only his reputation as an artist, but also his skill. By the 80s, Bacon was well and truly a famous art legend, which would come with potential issues when Francis would continue his old habit of scrapping and throwing away paintings he felt were not good enough. As by this time, people were now rummaging through Bacon's old canvases and scraps, knowing that such trinkets would be worth a fortune. What would also start making regular appearances during this particular decade was a vast collection of landscape paintings, a theme that Bacon had not experimented with since he recreated Van Gogh in the 50s. The painting titled A Piece of Wasteland, created in 1982, displays a vivid example of his rediscovered interest in landscapes, but the more subdued and minimal execution remains even in his landscapes, with more abstract shapes and less vibrant colours. By 1979 or 1980, John Edwards was spending a great deal of his time living with Francis Bacon at Rhys Mews, and was beginning to appear with Francis at more of his art events. Francis would eventually purchase a house for Edwards just around the corner from Rhys Mews. As the relationship continued between Edwards and Bacon, the artist's intimate circles, of whom had been friends for a good couple of decades now, could not help but wonder how exactly Edwards fit in with everything and everyone. Not just due to his young age compared to Bacon, but he also had very little in common with the art crowd, nor did he even like Bacon's paintings, nor did he even fit in with the wealthy friendship groups. Being just an East End pub runner from a less than modest background, conversations would erupt into what could this man possibly want out of Francis? The answer was unfavourable, yet one that Francis never denied. Francis had the money to spare. He was a world-famous artist after all, and he seemed to have no quarrels helping the young man with financial needs, even going as far as reportedly passing over his entire estate to John in his will should Francis soon pass away. Unfortunately, the 80s would unearth occasional rifts between the two, however, as Francis would begin to fall deeper into his insecurities about his age and his appearance. He would soon become incredibly conscious and jealous of anyone getting too close to John. Edwards too would also not adjust well to Paris, forcing Francis to eventually accept that try as he might to live in Paris was to remain a dream, and that too much of his personal and social life remained in London. Probably the hardest fact Francis would come to accept is that John was also already in a long-term relationship with a man named Philip Mordew, whom Edwards went off with to America and Thailand at some stage in the latter side of the 80s. The up and down companionship between him and Edwards would not be the only worries for Francis during this time, as his health was sadly beginning to worsen, often complaining of feeling ill to close friends like Valerie Beston on a weekly basis. Francis would begin having to keep oxygen cylinders within his art studio to battle with his asthma problems, and by 1987, his chest would begin to heave and he would collapse in the middle of one of his openings in Paris to an asthma attack. It would only be 2 years later that Francis would eventually have to be rushed to hospital to have a cancerous kidney removed. As if to render his sense of mortality into further dismay, this truly appeared to be the beginning of the end for the artist.
The thing about life is, after the age of about 30, what is there, in a sense, fundamentally but death? That's not looking towards despair, by the way, but it's just a realization that there is the grave coming up closer and closer, closer and closer.
Even during the final years of his life, Francis Bacon still desired and longed for an intimate relationship. Even though he was nearly 80, and even though he was still keeping in contact with John, in either 1987 or 1988, depending on the source you read, Francis would start a brief, final love affair with a young Spaniard named José Capello. José was a 32-year-old banker and management consultant from Madrid, whom Francis met at a party hosted by the British choreographer Sir Frederick Ashton. José was intelligent, charming, and happened to be a huge admirer of Bacon's work, as well as educated in art. Bacon was enamoured by José, but the young Spaniard would later deny that they shared any intimate relationship. Coincidentally, Francis had spoken out to friends about a desire to once again escape London. This time he desired the beauty and warmth of Spain, and was beginning to teach himself Spanish in his spare time or with occasional help from José. Some might argue that Francis chose Madrid as his new adventure because of his new Mediterranean man that he had met, but most likely the reason was that even in his weak health and frailty, Francis still desired to travel and not be tied down to one place at one time. Perhaps the failure of settling down in Paris prompted the artist to look towards the neighbouring country this time, but either way, Bacon's doctor would strongly advise against it. Dr. Paul Brass, who was still Bacon's doctor, kept warning the artist that continuous travelling will increase his chances of falling ill and possibly dying. But as old as Bacon's body was, his mind had not aged a day, and he was becoming easily irritable when too unwell to paint or travel. Bacon remains a highly respected name in the art world as well. In 1988, an exhibition of his would open for the first time in Moscow, which in fact would mark the first time work by a British artist had ever been shown in the Soviet Union. The following year, in 1989, a major retrospective would open at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, further cementing Bacon's impact in the States. He also adored and supported young advocates in art, often excited when such wide-eyed students would approach him on the streets and profess their inspiration of him. By 1990, against Dr. Brass's wishes, Francis would continue to travel. He would visit Madrid with José, and for the first time, he would experience the Velázquez exhibition at the Prado. They would also travel together to Paris, Toulouse, and Venice. By the time Francis had his kidney removed, however, Bacon's health was beginning to spiral. By 1992, he was suffering from acute chest problems brought on by his lifelong curse of asthma. Sometimes spending a great deal of his day chained to an oxygen canister and being unable to walk as far, he would still try his best to spend as much time with his family and friends as possible, even remaining non-formal and charismatic in interviews, looking at the world around him as just another opportunity for a fresh start, not knowing what the next day might bring. Even with Dr. Brass telling him point blank that Francis would need to commute carrying oxygen around and would almost certainly die if he pursued to Madrid to be with José, Francis, it would seem, cared little for the consequences. "I want to go to Spain," he would exclaim. "I have to be with José, I just have to go to Spain." Perhaps deep down, Francis knew he was going to die, but wanted to do so whilst visiting the places and people he loved. Within just days of arriving in Madrid, Francis fell critically ill and began to retain fluid, and so was taken to the Clinica Robert, the leading private hospital in the city. During his stay, much to his surprise, Francis was nursed by the nuns of a Catholic institution of the Servants of Mary, or otherwise known as Ministers to the Sick. It was customary for nuns to work in Spanish hospitals, and despite what we know of Bacon's experiences and thoughts on religion, the artist would not object to their care during his final days at the hospital. On the morning of April 28, 1992, a night nurse reported that Bacon was up all night, struggling to breathe, too weak to eat his breakfast, and constantly needing oxygen in high doses. At roughly 8:30, his breathing would worsen and suddenly stop. Cardiac arrest units would arrive to monitor and save his failing heart, but at around 9 AM, Bacon would be pronounced dead. The last two paintings of Francis Bacon were found at Rhys Mews following his death in Madrid. as if to render the eerie notion of Bacon's death and his body practically vanishing in a faraway country more profound. The last two paintings serve as almost a private exhibition into Bacon's final acceptance and view on his own mortality, with many believing these paintings were created with Francis, fully knowing they would be his last. His unfinished painting, titled Self-Portrait, dated in either 1992 or the year before, was found resting on the easel at Rhys Mews. It's a fascinating glance into Bacon's early stages of creating a painting, showing his technique of experimenting with brushstrokes or leaving it to chance, as he himself would put it. Although it is clearly unfinished, what makes it so mysterious is that it's still unknown when exactly he stopped working on this painting, whether it was a whole year or only a day before he left for the last time to Madrid, leaving us to wonder when Bacon really thought it was time to put down the brush for the last time. But the second painting, found in his studio, would display a far more substantial amount of telling imagery that could support the potential anticipation Francis felt for his death. This last finished painting of Bacon's is titled Study of a Bull, completed in 1991. A minimalistic yet haunting representation of a smoke-like bull proudly emerging from a dark opening into a bright, white space or abstract doorways. The painting is oil on unprimed canvas, with aerosol paint and dust particles. The bull by now was a prominent figure in Bacon's paintings, as we know, with his fascination and concepts of a bullfight still glowing in his mind. But what is also significant about the bull is his ancient symbolism of life and power, whilst also, in Bacon's mind, the bullfight being a symbol of sacrifice. The use of dust in this painting also offers a potent cipher for death and mortality, whilst representing permanence as well. As Bacon once said, dust seems to be eternal, seems to be the one thing that lasts forever. As Bacon had requested, his remains were cremated in Spain and there was no service held at the crematorium. His ashes were transported to England, where they were scattered in a private ceremony. For those who might not be aware, fairly recently to the time of me uploading this video, I was fortunate enough to visit the temporary exhibition of Francis Bacon at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. The exhibition was curated by that one person I have mentioned a lot in this series, the close friend and art historian Michael Pepeot. And I realise now that even though I mentioned him a lot and sourced a great deal of information from him, I haven't actually gone into much detail of how the two met each other. And considering what remarkable things this man has done for Francis Bacon's legacy, I think it's worth a quick rundown. Pepeot met Bacon in June 1963 in Soho's French house to request an interview for a student magazine he was editing. Bacon invited him to lunch, and they soon began a friendship that would continue until Bacon's death roughly 30 years later. Pepeot would help Bacon find new studios to work in, document Bacon's life and career, help him make connections, and of course, following his death, would go on to create exhibitions for Bacon's art and write many biographical books on him. And by the 29th of January until the 17th of April 2022, Pepeot would create his next commemorative exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts. When I walked through the large showrooms of that very same exhibition and saw the equally large paintings of Bacon up close, some of which I've never seen or recognised before, I was instantly enchanted. Each painting was displayed in colossal, elaborate gold frames, which was Bacon's preference, and seeing the brushstrokes up close was a truly awe-inspiring experience. The atmosphere and the mood of the other people at the exhibition was deeply profound. It took me back to the very first time I saw Bacon's art at the Tate Gallery when I was young. Seeing the famous red triptych of 3 studies for figures at the base of a crucifixion, wondering just who on earth would create such a vision that haunted and inspired me ever since. Fast forward to present day, and I'm equally as moved, and probably more so, by Bacon's art. After learning more about his life and his painting, learning from his countless interviews and his outlook on life, I think I now fully understand why. Even as a child, an untapped part of me longed for things that stood out from the norm in either bizarre or shocking ways. In almost intrusive ways, like a new painting I see or a new song I listen to is grabbing me by the shoulders and shaking me. But as I grew older and began to face my own struggles with growing up and building my confidence, I also longed for art, music and film that could mirror my darkest, saddest and I guess more rebellious experiences with life that most people come to face during their adolescence. An artist like Francis Bacon would echo such reflections perfectly, but in a way that is perpetual. His portrayal of a human spirit, his extraction of the beast and the man, still remains relevant to this day. Last Tango in Paris would not be the only film to absorb the influence of Francis Bacon's chaotic artwork. After Bacon's death, filmmakers, musicians and artists from all around the world would become enthralled with Bacon's life and paintings. David Lynch is reportedly inspired by him. The artist H.R. Giger's designs of that gross yet awesome infant extraterrestrial creature in Ridley Scott's 1979 Alien movie was apparently imagined and modelled on the figures in the 1944 triptych, 3 Studies for Figures at the Base of a Crucifixion. Another conceptual artist I'm very keen on, Damien Hirst, would even make a physical 3D triptych inspired by Bacon's tight, claustrophobic spaces, called The Tranquility of Solitude for George Dyer in 2006. Whether you believe Bacon's views and outlook on life was too pessimistic or controversial, and whilst I certainly don't agree with everything Bacon said and did, you cannot deny that his art is timeless in its execution. And in one form or another, his ideas and creations resonate with someone from every generation. Perhaps still a relatively shy and anxious man who struggled with asthma, who said he couldn't draw right up to his death, I think if he could see the way the world cherishes his art now, Bacon would truly feel he had achieved everything possible that a great artist could achieve. And rightfully so. His paintings for the very first time in British art galleries, and eventually the world, hung in showrooms with no apology, no filter, to arguably a less open-minded audience than today. A saying that Banksy once made famous, which I think couldn't be more true when it comes to art, is that art should comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Nothing could be more true when it comes to Bacon's art, in my opinion. For the first time in this kind of style, art had become fashionably rebellious, rather than just blasphemous or treasonous, as controversial art had been in history before. He showed that violence can be beautiful in art, and even eroticized, in ambiguous ways that still add a degree of mystery. And what makes it so unique is that it all came from a genuine place, from a man who felt socially rejected for a great deal of his life. Let's not forget that he was of the same generation of Alan Turing, a man celebrated for successfully assisting the British break the Enigma code in World War II, but who was also homosexual, which eventually led to his unjustified arrest and his suicide. It was a very bleak, dangerous, and uncertain experience to be homosexual. But art gave Francis a voice, a chance to show the potential flaws of humanity in a more physical way. It is almost justified in a sense the way that Francis would reveal such concepts so shamelessly. He, as well as his paintings, had no filter or patience for dishonesty. Right up to when his body began to fail, he couldn't resist the sarcasm and cheeky banter that he was loved for by his friends and despised for by his enemies or an unsuspecting journalist. It's a period in art that to me sounded genuinely exciting and refreshing. And although such a time like this may never come again in today's current climate when it comes to art, at least now we can look back on Bacon as one of the true greats in art history. An artist who showed people fear when they wanted comfort. A man infamous for causing a potential riot, but still professional when it came to his paintings. A man who put love in quotation marks, but always remembered by many as a loving friend, a devoted partner, and a man who loved to talk and be around people, with a heart that always poured into his work, right up to the very end. So that brings us to the end of Francis Bacon and his artwork. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it's been informative for you. There's still quite a few triptychs and portraits of his that I didn't have time to show and discuss, so I urge you to keep a lookout for any exhibitions of Francis Bacon that may be near you to experience his paintings for yourself. It's astounding how many lost or lesser known paintings of his pop up in galleries from time to time. I also strongly recommend giving Francis Bacon Revelations a read for yourself as well. This particular biography was strongly supported by the estate of Francis Bacon, and it helped me with a lot of my research about his more day-to-day life for this series. I'm not endorsed in any way, I just think it's a very well written biography that's just jam-packed full of information. Before I go, I have some new art to share from one of my viewers from my end of video feature, Artist Corner, and today's featured artist is Devin Parker Jacobs, a multimedia artist from Detroit, Michigan, USA. Although currently well on the way to a career as a tattoo artist, Devin originally did not pursue art during his education. However, while studying social work at Wayne State University, he found himself surrounded by art that strongly inspired him. Due to financial instability, Devin would unfortunately have to step away from college, but would rapidly find success in his art after dedicating more time to it again. What initially took Devin's career off is doing something called thrift repainting, where he would paint over used thrift store reproductions of art, usually adding pop culture or cartoon characters into landscapes that would generally collect dust on a used store shelf. This experimental style of painting is what gave him the ability to pursue different avenues of art that led to the stunning collection of surreal digital art that you see here now. Devin is particularly keen on using digital gouache paints and is intending to use them physically in the future. My favourite of his from what I've seen so far is the one titled "We Only Did It for the Money." This stunning, thought-provoking work and title can practically speak for itself in terms of what it conveys, but Devin explains it was inspired by an instance in which his sister left a troubled life to find a new start with religion. The painting is a commentary on the reasons why people may turn to organised religion, money being one of the main components of people's relationship in the church in some cases. Digital art is something I'm not very familiar with, even though I use loads of programs for my editing. I'm always amazed at how authentic and physical it can be at times when it's done right. That's why I love Devin's collection. If it's digital art, that makes me still have to double check with the artists if it's a photo of real paint on canvas or not. It's a good sign in my book. He tells me he's deeply inspired by Francis Bacon, and from the very similar raw imagery that Devin presents, it's crystal clear to see. I strongly urge you to check out more of Devin's art and show him some love via the links that you see here and in the description below. If you're an artist and you want a chance to see your work in my videos, I'm open to all kinds of work. Please email me examples of your work and a bit about yourself to blinddweller@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. And as always, a huge thank you to my top tier channel members for this month: Classy Chassis, Wendy Go, Ken B, Carol Hartung, and Garrett Greathouse. Your donations are hugely appreciated, guys. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. If you'd also like a shout out in a future video or want to see my videos early, please consider becoming a channel member today for as little as $2.99 a month. That's all for me today. See you in the next video soon, and bye for now.